Some of you in the room join me weekly on Wednesday mornings. We learn Shemot Emet, and I started because we just went through our first full book of the Torah. We learned the book of Bereshit, and now we're starting our second book. So I started with an opening question that took us most of the class to get through, which is, do we know what exile feels like? We're starting the book of Exodus, which is a story of exile and redemption. And this question that I've been pondering about all week long is whether or not we actually know in 2025 what the idea, 2026, what the idea of exile actually feels like. And what's so important about the beginning of the book of Exodus is it's the first time that we tell our story of exile and redemption, but it's also a pattern that will repeat many, many times throughout Jewish history. And even though for us, I'll speak for me, the idea of exile sort of feels distant. It's something that we study rather than something that I feel like I truly live. And that is a lot because I feel that diaspora Judaism is really important. We can talk about that at Kiddush. But the distance between whether or not we experience exile is really important for how we read the Parsha, and also really important for how we read the entirety of the book of Shemot. Because Parshat Shemot opens the story of redemption not with action, but actually with a problem of recognition. So before Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites, the Torah tells us that a new king arose who did not know Yosef. On the surface, this seems like normal politics. New leadership means that old promises are forgotten, history is sort of put in the past, and the new leader is going to take over. But our commentators aren't satisfied with that explanation alone. I'll start with the Shemot Emet, which, by the way, is a Hasidic teacher from the late 1800s in Poland. He hears something deeper in this forgetting. Yosef represents an inner point of connection among the people of Israel. The capacity to remain a single people despite difference and displacement and pressure. It's easy, and I think that we sort of think that Yosef's story ended back in Bereshit, but he's still very much alive, sort of ending his tenure as a leader in Pharaoh's palace at the opening of Shemot. Yosef is the one who can keep unity even in hard times when his life and his family's life is complicated and pressure mounts. And so the idea that the Torah tells us Pharaoh doesn't know Yosef is not just a political change, it's a sign that the people, that the inner glue that held these people together is starting to crack. For the Shemot Emet, exile doesn't start with harsh treatment. It starts when the bonds between people start to weaken, when trust is lost, and when unity fades. We see this in the opening of Shemot. Moshe tries to stop two Israelites who are fighting, and one of them snaps back, saying, "Who made you the ruler over us?" It's not just defiance of Moshe or not knowing Moshe. It's the sound of people who no longer recognize each other as bound together. Fracture begins. It's like fear and suspicion are creeping up amongst the Israelites. And though Pharaoh's oppression hasn't fully taken hold, the Israelites themselves are struggling to stay together. So in this reading, exile does not begin with cruelty. It begins before that with disintegration. And this framing matters because it changes how we understand the unfolding of the Exodus story. If exile begins with something hidden breaking apart, then redemption begins with something hidden that's still burning. And that's where we get the burning bush. When God first appears to Moshe at the burning bush, it's not at a moment of readiness or strength. Moshe is not leading or organizing or even connected to his people. He's a shepherd. He's living far from Egypt, far from the Israelites, and far from any obvious sense of purpose. And what he sees isn't a miracle that fixes everything. It's the burning bush that's unconsumed. The Sfat Emet says that the fire of this bush is like the soul of Israel. It's alive and connected to God, but it's hidden. The fire is real, but it hasn't changed the world yet. God doesn't appear suddenly at the burning bush. God was present all along, but in a different form that Moshe had not yet recognized. It's like when a community goes through a crisis. The values and relationships that hold people together are still there, but they're buried under fear and uncertainty. The strength exists, it just hasn't found its voice. That idea becomes clearer when we look at how God presents God's self. God's named Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am that I am. But the Hebrew sort of points us elsewhere because the word Ehyeh is future. I will be. God is saying, I'm present, but not yet visible in the way you need. Not yet accessible. Not yet organizing the world towards justice. God's not trying to be one that comforts. God is trying to be honest. And in that, teaching us that redemption isn't instant. It's a process. Another commentator, the Or HaChaim, says that going down to Egypt, that the Israelites going down and eventually becoming slaves wasn't random. It was meant to bring out hidden strength, but only through struggle. This feels pretty real to me today. We know what it's like when trust breaks down, when voices compete, when people aren't sure what's true. Fear spreads not just because of danger, but because the reality itself is scary. When narrative fractures, communities fracture with them. The Torah describes this condition with precision. A people can be physically present and spiritually disoriented at the same time. God can be present and yet not fully legible. That's what the burning bush represents. Presence without clarity, connection without resolution. The commentators say that Moshe had to turn on his side to see the burning bush. Not because God suddenly appears, but because attention is required to notice what doesn't announce itself clearly. Revelation in that moment is not about certainty. It's about the willingness to pause, to interrupt routine, and to look carefully at something unresolved rather than walking past it. And most importantly, the bush isn't redemption, it's preparation. Before we read about miracles and freedom, before we read about the giving of the Torah, Moshe has to learn what his task will be. It's not about starting from scratch, it's about finding what was lost. It's about rebuilding trust and restoring connection and helping the people become whole enough to move forward together. Audre Lorde, who speaks from a very different tradition, said it simply: without community, there's no liberation. The Torah knew this long before we did. Redemption isn't just about breaking Pharaoh's grip. It's about repairing what has been fractured inside, so that fear and suspicion don't keep us apart. This is why God's name matters so much in the beginning of the Shemot story. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh doesn't promise any clarity. It doesn't offer any comfort or closure. It signals presence that hasn't yet taken shape in the world. I will be means that God isn't absent, but also not finished, not yet manifest in a way that organizes reality towards justice or safety or trust. And Shemot is honest about this gap, the gap that God is present, but the people are hurting. The fire is burning, and the bush is still a bush. There's no redemption. What the Torah expects from us when we live in moments like this, when truth feels unstable, when fear spreads faster than facts, when communities begin to fracture under pressure, The Torah doesn't want us to pretend like we've been redeemed. It asks us, how do we live responsibly in the space between exile and redemption? And Moshe shows us that he doesn't leave the bush with a plan. He leaves with a task. He's sent to a divided people, into a place of mistrust and danger, with slow work of rebuilding connection. He's tasked of helping people recognize one another as bound together. That's where redemption begins, not with spectacle, but with repair. The Sfat Emet teaches us that exile begins when connection is lost. That means redemption begins when connection is built, when people choose to see one another as part of the same story, even when it's difficult or fear is loud. And we're not offered reassurance that everything will solve neatly. But what it offers us is something more demanding: responsibility. How do we physically and metaphorically turn aside, notice what is still burning beneath the surface, to refuse the lie that disintegration is inevitable? Because we know that the fire is real and the connection is real, but sometimes not obvious. And the Torah insists that what is hidden is in God, and that noticing it or protecting it and rebuilding it together is how we reach redemption. Shabbat Shalom.